at 9:18 a.m. On November 16, 1981, inside a quiet Santa Monica apartment where the curtains had stayed drawn and the phone had rung into nothingness, police stepped into a room that smelled faintly of stale liquor and late-night cologne, and found William Franklin Holden, 63 years old, more than 3 decades on screen, an Academy Award winner, the kind of face that once sold tickets on its own, the kind of voice directors trusted to carry a final line. Lying on the floor as if the scene had been blocked for the camera, except there was no camera, no crew, no spotlight, only a dark stain that told the real story. Days earlier, after a night of drinking, he had fallen, split his forehead, and bled in silence long enough for Hollywood to keep spinning without noticing one of its old kings had already slipped off the throne. Outside, the Pacific air moved like nothing had happened, and somewhere a television was still selling the dream he no longer belonged to. How does a man who once stood at the center of the American myth end up dying like a stranger behind his own locked door? What had been breaking him long before his body finally did? This is the story the premieres never showed, the phone calls that stopped coming, the private rituals, and the final night when the legend disappeared in plain sight. The rise was not sudden, and that was part of what made William Holden so dangerous to himself, because it taught him patience, discipline, and the belief that if he simply kept showing up and doing the work, everything else would somehow arrange itself around him. Night after night, set after set, he learned to deliver exactly what was required, to hit his marks, to keep his voice steady even when the scene demanded despair, and over time that professional control hardened into a public mask that never slipped, a face the studios could trust and the audience could project onto whatever dream they needed that year. On soundstages lit like artificial suns and at premieres where champagne flowed before noon, Holden perfected the art of appearing untroubled, laughing at the right moments, deflecting questions with a practiced shrug, raising a glass not because he needed it yet, but because it belonged to the image, an accessory as expected as the tailored suit and the easy smile. In interviews, he spoke like a man who understood the game and had no intention of fighting it, someone who seemed grateful without appearing desperate, confident without arrogance. And that balance made him indispensable, the kind of star producers described as safe in an industry that quietly devoured the unsafe. But safety came at a cost. The more Holden embodied the calm, reliable leading man, the less room there was for doubt, grief, or fear. And so those emotions learned to wait until the doors were closed and the rooms were empty. Alcohol, at first, was simply a lubricant for the machine, a way to soften the edges of long days and late nights, a social ritual that kept conversations moving and expectations low. Then it became a switch, something he could flip to quiet the noise after the applause faded, to blur the line between the man he played and the man he was supposed to be when no one was watching. Friends noticed the pattern before the headlines ever could, the drinks arriving a little earlier, the silences stretching a little longer, the way he would stare into nothing as if rehearsing lines only he could hear. But in Hollywood, such details were easy to dismiss as the eccentricities of success. As the industry aged him out of the roles that had once defined him, Holden leaned harder into the mask, insisting on professionalism, on dignity, on the idea that a real star never complains and never begs, even as younger faces took the spotlight and the phone rang less often with offers that felt essential. The paradox was cruel. The very discipline that built his legend also trained him to endure discomfort without protest, to absorb disappointment quietly, to keep the show going even when the script no longer made sense. And so each small fracture, each missed opportunity, each reminder that time was winning, slid neatly behind the same composed expression the public adored. On screen, he played men confronting mortality and moral compromise with clear eyes. Off-screen, he postponed those confrontations indefinitely, trusting the mask to hold, trusting that the structure of his life would remain intact if he did not touch it too closely. But masks grow heavier with time, and the longer he wore his, the more it pressed down on everything underneath, until control itself became exhausting, until the effort of remaining William Holden began to suffocate the person who had once stepped into that role believing it was temporary. How long can a man live as a character before the real person underneath starts to disappear? And when that disappearance begins, who notices first, the audience or the man himself? The collapse had not begun on the night he fell. It had been unfolding quietly for years, disguised as endurance, dressed up as dignity, and excused as the natural fatigue of a man who had already given the world everything it wanted from him. Long before that final evening, Holden's days had narrowed into patterns that required no imagination and no confrontation, A life reduced to routines precise enough to feel safe but empty enough to feel endless. He woke late, moved slowly, and filled the hours with small, manageable tasks, as if keeping motion itself could keep the questions away. When evening came, he returned to the familiar comforts that asked nothing of him beyond repetition, pouring drinks with the same measured hand, sitting in the same chair, letting the television glow paint his aging face with images of a younger man who still belonged to the future. Friends spoke of dinners that never happened, invitations politely declined, conversations cut short by an unspoken exhaustion, and each refusal added another layer of distance between Holden and a world that had once felt inseparable from his identity. Hollywood, for its part, offered him respect without intimacy, praise without presence, and he accepted it all with the same calm smile he had worn for decades, never admitting that admiration was no substitute for connection. The industry had moved on gradually, not out of cruelty but momentum, and Holden found himself living in the afterimage of his own success. A man remembered everywhere and needed nowhere. Alcohol smoothed the transition, blurring the edges of loneliness and turning nights into something he could endure without too much reflection. But it also deepened the isolation, ensuring that the days bled into one another without distinction. The irony was merciless. The more he retreated, the easier it became for others to assume he preferred it that way, and so the silence around him grew heavier, reinforced by politeness and misunderstanding. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when he seemed aware of what was happening, when a remark slipped out about being tired, about feeling older than his years, about wondering how it all ends, but those moments passed quickly, swallowed by the habit of downplaying discomfort and changing the subject. Holden had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of making things look effortless, and now that same instinct kept him from reaching out, from admitting that the structure holding his life together was already bending. By the time the collapse reached its final form, it was almost invisible from the outside, a slow erosion rather than a dramatic fall, each lonely evening and unspoken fear carrying him closer to the moment when endurance would no longer be enough. How does a man recognize the end approaching when it looks so much like the days he has already learned to survive? And at what point does survival itself become the tragedy? The aftermath of William Holden's death unfolded not with scandalous revelations or public reckoning, but with a quieter shock that rippled through Hollywood in muted tones, as if the industry itself were unsure how loudly it was allowed to grieve a man who had slipped away so discreetly. When the news finally emerged, when it became clear that he had died days before being found, the details felt almost indecent in their ordinariness. A fall, a wound, blood, silence, time. Colleagues spoke in disbelief, not because death was unfamiliar to them, but because this particular ending seemed to contradict everything Holden had represented. He was not supposed to vanish unnoticed. He was supposed to receive a final close-up, a farewell worthy of his legacy. Instead, the story settled into the background noise of an industry always preparing for its next opening weekend. In the months and years that followed, conversations about Holden drifted toward nostalgia rather than mourning. His name invoked as shorthand for a lost era of restraint and professionalism. His films replayed on late-night television as artifacts of a Hollywood that no longer existed. Yet beneath that polished remembrance lay a more uncomfortable truth. The conditions that shaped his decline had never been unique to him. The isolation, the reliance on alcohol, the shrinking circle of genuine connection. These were not anomalies but patterns repeated again and again among those who outlived their moment at the center of attention. Friends who reflected on Holden's final years described a man who had grown smaller not in spirit, but in visibility. Someone whose world had contracted until daily routines replaced long-term plans, until tomorrow mattered less than getting through tonight. There were no grand comebacks to analyze, no dramatic public breakdowns to replay, only the slow realization that he had been living on borrowed time emotionally long before his body gave out. The tragedy of his decline was not that he suffered alone, many do, but that his suffering remained largely invisible, masked by the same composure that once made him indispensable. In retrospect, the signs appear almost cruelly obvious. The missed calls that no longer felt urgent, the friendships that became seasonal, the way familiarity turned into isolation when it went unexamined. Holden's death forced a brief, uneasy pause in the collective imagination of Hollywood. A reminder that applause does not translate into protection and that dignity, when taken too far, can become another form of silence. And yet, as quickly as that pause arrived, it faded, absorbed into the relentless forward motion of the industry, leaving behind a legacy preserved in film and a cautionary tale rarely spoken aloud. What remains most haunting is not the moment he died, but the realization that for years before it happened, he had already been living as if the world had gently stepped away, assuming he would be fine on his own. In the end, William Holden's story refuses to be reduced to a single bad night or a tragic accident, because the fall in that Santa Monica apartment was only the final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been writing itself for years. His life exposes an uncomfortable truth about fame that Hollywood rarely confronts honestly. Applause can become a substitute for intimacy, and professionalism can quietly replace vulnerability until a person no longer knows how to ask for help without feeling like they've failed. Holden was celebrated for his restraint, his control, his ability to carry weight without showing strain, yet those very qualities trained him to endure loneliness rather than challenge it, to manage pain privately instead of sharing it with the people who might have lightened the load. The mask worked too well. It protected the legend while suffocating the man, convincing him that dignity meant silence and that strength meant handling everything alone. For the audience watching decades later, the lesson is not about alcohol or aging out of stardom alone, but about the quiet bargains people make with themselves when success becomes identity and identity leaves no room for weakness. Holden's life reminds us that no number of awards, no iconic roles, no reputation for calm professionalism can replace the simple, fragile bonds that make survival meaningful. In a world that rewards performance above honesty, he became proof that being admired is not the same as being known, and that the most dangerous moments often arrive not with chaos, but with routine. His legacy, then, is not only preserved in the films that continue to play on glowing screens, but in the warning they now carry. If the mask never comes off, the person underneath may fade long before anyone notices. In the quiet after the headlines faded, William Holden's story settled into a kind of unresolved stillness, the sort that lingers long after the screen goes dark. The Santa Monica apartment returned to being just another address, the night of November 12th receding into the background of Hollywood lore, mentioned briefly, then politely set aside. What endured instead were images. A man standing tall in black and white films, eyes steady, voice calm, the embodiment of control. And somewhere far from the glow of premieres, a room where no one arrived in time. The circle closes there, not with spectacle but with absence. The empty chair, the unanswered phone, the life that ended without witnesses because it had been lived too carefully, too quietly, for too long. Holden gave the world characters who faced danger, love, and loss with clarity, yet his final lesson came not from a script, but from the contrast between who he appeared to be and how he actually lived when the applause stopped. In the end, the legend Hollywood adored was simply a human being who carried his burdens alone until carrying them became impossible. A man who might have benefited from less restraint and more confession. His story asks something gentle but urgent of those who hear it now, to check on the people who seem strongest, to question the comfort of routine silence, and to remember that no performance, no matter how flawless, can replace connection. Because when the lights finally go out, what remains is not the image we projected, but the love we allowed ourselves to accept, and the love we were brave enough to return.